Beneath the scorched sands of southern Iraq lie secrets that remained buried for nearly 2,000 years. When French and British archaeologists began excavating these ancient mounds in the 19th century, they weren't searching for the Sumerians. They were hunting for evidence of the Assyrians, those biblical villains whose stone palaces and fearsome warriors had captured European imagination. What they found instead was something far more profound. Layer by layer, as they dug deeper through millennia of accumulated earth, they discovered traces of a civilization so ancient that even the Assyrians considered it legendary. Clay tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped marks, massive temple platforms rising like artificial mountains, cities whose very names had been forgotten by history. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people, and they spoke a language completely unrelated to any known linguistic family on Earth. When scholars finally deciphered their script in the mid-1800s, they realized they were reading humanity's oldest written words. These weren't mythological figures or legendary kingdoms distorted by centuries of oral tradition. The Sumerians were real, and they had invented civilization itself. But here's where the story becomes genuinely mysterious. Nobody knows where the Sumerians came from. Their language bears no relationship to the Semitic tongues spoken by their neighbors, nor to Indo-European, nor to any other language group scholars have identified. Some theories suggest origins in India or Persia. Others point toward the Caspian Sea region. Genetic studies, linguistic analysis, and archaeological excavation have all failed to provide a definitive answer. The Sumerians appear in southern Mesopotamia around 3600 BC like actors stepping onto a stage whose entrance nobody witnessed. Recent research published in 2024 has challenged even our most fundamental assumptions about how Sumerian civilization began. For decades, textbooks claimed that large-scale irrigation projects in the desert created the agricultural surplus that enabled city formation. But this presents what archaeologist Reed Goodman calls a chicken and egg problem. How do you gather enough people to build massive irrigation systems before you have the governmental structures to organize them? The new paleo-environmental evidence suggests something radically different. The earliest Sumerians didn't conquer the desert through monumental engineering. They harnessed the tides, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where they approached the Persian Gulf, experienced dramatic tidal fluctuations that the Sumerians learned to exploit for agriculture. These natural rhythms of water didn't require massive coordinated labor. Small communities could take advantage of tidal irrigation, grow surplus crops, and gradually accumulate the population density that enabled urban development. Only later, once cities had already formed and political hierarchies emerged, did the Sumerians construct those famous canal networks that reshaped the landscape. This discovery fundamentally rewrites the story of civilization's origins. The Sumerians built their world literally on the rhythms of water, and that aquatic foundation permeated everything from their flood myths to their pantheon of water-centered deities. Before the Sumerians dominated the region, an earlier people known to archaeologists as the Ubaidians had established settlements in southern Mesopotamia as early as 5300 BC. These Proto-Euphrateans cultivated agriculture, raised livestock, wove textiles, worked with pottery and carpentry, and apparently enjoyed beer. They built villages that slowly grew into towns. The archaeological record shows uninterrupted cultural continuity from these Ubaid settlements into what we recognize as Sumerian civilization. But whether the Ubaidians were themselves Sumerians, or whether the Sumerians were migrants who adopted and transformed Ubaid culture, remains one of archaeology's great unsolved puzzles. By 3000 BC, Sumer consisted of roughly a dozen major city-states scattered across the alluvial plains between the two great rivers. Each city functioned as an independent political entity, surrounded by defensive walls with villages clustered beyond. The names of these cities still echo through history: Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, Ur, and then there was Uruk. Uruk wasn't just the largest of the Sumerian cities. It was the first true city in human history. At its peak, around 2800 BC, somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people lived within its 6 miles of defensive walls, making it likely the largest urban center on Earth. The city covered approximately 250 hectares, nearly 1 square mile of dense urban settlement with monumental architecture, specialized craft quarters, administrative buildings, and vast temple complexes. The scale of Uruk defies easy comprehension. This was a Bronze Age metropolis rivaling many medieval European capitals in size and sophistication. The Sumerian king list, a document that later scribes would compile to establish political legitimacy, claimed that kingship itself descended from heaven at Eridu, the oldest of the sacred cities. The Sumerians believed their god Enki brought civilization fully formed to Eridu's shores. Modern archaeology tells a more complex story of gradual development, but the Sumerians' own mythology reveals something profound about how they understood themselves as participants in a divine order established at the beginning of time. Each city-state operated under the protection of a patron deity who was believed to physically dwell in the city's central temple. These weren't abstract spiritual forces. The gods had appetites, desires, and personalities. They required feeding, bathing, and entertainment. The elaborate daily rituals performed in Sumerian temples treated the divine statues as living beings who needed care and service. This understanding shaped the entire social structure. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was the god's household, and the surrounding city existed to serve that household's needs. The shift from temple-centered theocracy to secular kingship marked a crucial transition in Sumerian political development. Initially, a council of elders led by priestly figures governed the cities. But as conflict between city-states intensified, the need for military leadership elevated the role of the Lugal, literally, great man. These war leaders gradually transformed into hereditary kings who wielded both political and military authority. Yet the priests never lost their influence entirely. Sumerian kingship always maintained its divine sanction, with rulers claiming legitimacy through their relationship with the city's patron deity. It was within this urban crucible that humanity's most transformative innovation emerged. Sometime around 3200 BC, Sumerian scribes in the city of Uruk began pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets. The invention of writing changed everything. The evolution from simple accounting to full linguistic expression happened gradually. Initially, Sumerian merchants used small clay tokens to represent trade goods. One token for a sheep, another for a jar of oil. These tokens would be placed inside sealed clay envelopes, and to show what was inside without breaking the seal, they pressed the tokens against the envelope's exterior. Eventually, some clever scribe realized you could skip the tokens entirely and just press marks directly into the clay. These marks began as pictographs, simple pictures of the objects they represented. A circular impression indicated grain, a particular symbol meant sheep, but pictographs have severe limitations. How do you draw an abstract concept like justice or wisdom? How do you indicate whether those sheep are being delivered to the temple or received from it? The crucial breakthrough came when scribes began using symbols not for the objects they depicted, but for the sounds those words made. This rebus principle transformed writing from a basic inventory system into a complete linguistic tool capable of recording anything the human voice could express. By 2600 BC, cuneiform writing, so named by 19th century scholars from the Latin word cunis, meaning wedge, had evolved into a sophisticated system combining pictographs, phonetic syllables, and determinative signs that clarified meaning. The number of symbols decreased from roughly 1,500 to about 600, making the system more learnable while expanding its expressive power. Scribes could now record laws, compose poetry, preserve religious texts, document astronomical observations, and chronicle historical events. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving literary masterpiece, emerged from this Sumerian innovation. The poem tells of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and his quest for immortality after the death of his beloved companion Enkidu. It grapples with profound themes of friendship, mortality, the limits of human achievement, and humanity's relationship with the divine. Fragments of the epic date back to the early 2nd millennium BC, though the story itself likely originated much earlier in Sumerian oral tradition. This wasn't mere entertainment. It was philosophy, psychology, and theology woven into narrative form. What's staggering is that approximately 500,000 cuneiform tablets have been excavated from Mesopotamian sites. Yet the vast majority remain untranslated. Thousands of these clay documents sit in museum storage rooms and university basements, waiting for scholars with the specialized knowledge to decipher them. Each tablet potentially contains recipes we've never tasted, mathematical insights we haven't rediscovered, historical events lost to our chronicles, or literary works that could reshape our understanding of ancient thought. The Sumerians left us a massive archive, but we've barely begun reading it. The Sumerians understood themselves as servants created for divine purposes. Their cosmology began with Namu, the primeval waters and chaos from which everything emerged. Namu gave birth to An, the sky, and Ki, the earth. These primordial forces mated to produce the first generation of gods, and from this divine lineage came the Anunnaki, the great gods who governed cosmic order. At the peak of the pantheon stood An, the supreme sky god and ancestor of all other deities. His power was absolute but distant. The god who dominated daily Sumerian religious life was Enlil, lord of wind and storms, chief god of the pantheon and patron of Nippur. Enlil held the tablets of destiny that determined the fate of gods and mortals alike. His temple at Nippur served as a kind of religious capital where kingship was legitimized through priestly blessing. But the god who most clearly embodied Sumerian values was Enki, lord of the freshwater ocean, beneath the earth called the Abzu. Enki was the god of wisdom, magic, crafts, and, crucially, the creator and protector of humanity. While Enlil could be harsh and authoritarian, Enki displayed consistent compassion for human beings. In the Sumerian flood myth, when Enlil decided to destroy humanity through catastrophic flooding, it was Enki who warned the righteous man, Ziusudra, and instructed him to build a boat to preserve human and animal life. This story predates the biblical Noah narrative by more than 1,000 years and likely provided its template. Enki guarded the Mi, those divine decrees or fundamental powers that enabled civilization to function. The Mi encompassed everything from kingship and priesthood to truth and art, from sexual intercourse to musical instruments. These weren't abstract principles but actual cosmic powers that could be stolen, transferred, or manipulated. One of Sumer's most revealing myths describes how Inanna, the powerful goddess of love and war, traveled to Enki's temple in Eridu and got him drunk at a feast. In his intoxicated state, Enki gave away the Mi to Inanna, who loaded them onto the boat of heaven and sailed toward her city of Uruk. When Enki sobered up and realized what he'd done, he sent various supernatural creatures to retrieve the Mi, but Inanna's loyal servant Ninshubur defended the boat through each challenge. The Mi reached Uruk, and Enki, powerless to stop her, had to accept the transfer. This myth likely preserves the memory of an actual historical shift in political power from Eridu to Uruk, but it also reveals how the Sumerians understood divine authority as something that could migrate between cities and deities through cunning rather than pure force. Inanna didn't conquer Enki, she outmaneuvered him. Inanna herself deserves special attention because she was arguably the most important female deity in Mesopotamian religion. Goddess of love, sexuality, fertility, and war, Inanna embodied contradictions that made her both compelling and terrifying. She could bestow prosperity or bring destruction. Her most famous myth describes her descent into the underworld to visit her sister, Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. As Inanna passed through each of the 7 gates leading downward, she was forced to remove one piece of her divine regalia until she arrived naked and powerless before the 7 judges of the underworld, who sentenced her to death. Only through the sacrifice of her lover, Dumuzid, was Inanna able to return from death. But this annual descent and return became the mythological explanation for seasonal cycles, fertility and growth during Inanna's presence, barrenness during her absence in the underworld. This wasn't primitive superstition, it was sophisticated theological thinking about the relationship between sexuality and death, power and vulnerability, the divine and the mortal. The physical manifestations of Sumerian religion dominated the urban landscape through massive temple complexes called ziggurats. These stepped pyramids, typically square or rectangular at the base, rose in terraces to heights reaching 170 feet. The ziggurat wasn't hollow like an Egyptian pyramid. It was a solid mountain of mud brick, with a temple sanctuary at its summit, where the deity was believed to dwell. Pilgrims would ascend the external staircases as a journey from the earthly realm toward the divine sphere. The terraces often featured gardens that would have appeared miraculous in the desert landscape. The legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon likely evolved from this Sumerian architectural tradition. The ziggurat of Ur, built by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC and dedicated to Nana the moon god, still stands in partial ruin today. Its base measures roughly 200 by 140 feet, and its original height probably exceeded 70 feet across 3 terraces. This single structure required millions of mud bricks and represented an investment of labor and resources that staggers modern comprehension. The ziggurat wasn't just architecture, it was theology made visible, a statement that the gods dwelled among their people and that human effort could build a bridge between earth and heaven. The Sumerians didn't just invent writing and monumental architecture. They pioneered the mathematical and technological foundations that would shape human civilization for millennia. Their number system operated on a base 60 principle rather than the base 10 system we use today. This sexagesimal mathematics might seem arbitrary, but 60 has the advantage of being evenly divisible by many factors. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes calculations involving fractions remarkably elegant. We still use Sumerian base 60 mathematics every time we check the time. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. Or measure angles in a circle with 360 degrees. The Sumerians essentially invented the concept of dividing time into standardized units and established the hours that make up a workday versus rest periods. Their mastery of hydraulic engineering transformed southern Mesopotamia from marshland into the breadbasket that could support massive urban populations. The elaborate canal networks didn't just irrigate fields, they controlled flooding, enabled transportation of goods, provided fish and waterfowl for food, and created a landscape where the boundary between land and water remained in constant productive flux. Some individual canals stretched over 100 miles, requiring maintenance and administration on a massive scale. The coordination necessary for these systems helped drive the development of bureaucratic government. The wheel appears in Sumerian contexts by 3500 BC, though whether they invented it or adopted it from elsewhere remains uncertain. More clear is their development of the two-wheeled chariot, which revolutionized warfare and allowed for much faster long-distance travel. These weren't casual innovations. The chariot required sophisticated carpentry, metalworking for axles and fittings, and animal training. It represented the integration of multiple technologies into a single transformative tool. Sumerian metallurgy advanced bronze working to new levels of sophistication. They created intricate sculptures, ceremonial weapons, musical instruments, and everyday tools with a technical precision that wouldn't be matched for centuries. The royal cemetery at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, revealed golden helmets, lapis lazuli jewelry, elaborate daggers, and a stunning bull-headed lyre whose reconstruction can still move modern listeners when played with period-appropriate technique. They brewed beer. Archaeological evidence of beer making in Mesopotamia dates back to the 4th millennium BC, and the Sumerians left behind detailed brewing recipes. Beer wasn't recreational luxury. It was nutritional staple, safer to drink than water, and central to religious and social rituals. The hymn to Ninkasi, goddess of beer, was actually a brewing recipe set to verse so brewers could memorize the process. The poem describes malting barley, mixing it with sweet aromatics, baking brewing bread, fermenting the mixture, and pouring the finished beer into collecting vessels. Beer was wages for workers, offerings for gods, and the social lubricant at every important gathering. Perhaps most significantly, the Sumerians created some of humanity's earliest law codes. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to approximately 2100 BC, predates Hammurabi's more famous Babylonian code by 3 centuries, where Hammurabi's laws famously prescribed an eye for an eye. Ur-Nammu's code often mandated monetary compensation instead of physical punishment. If a man severed another man's foot, he paid 10 shekels of silver. For breaking a bone, 1 shekel. The code also established legal protections for widows and orphans, regulated marriage and divorce, and standardized weights and measures to prevent commercial fraud. This wasn't primitive revenge justice. It was sophisticated legal thinking that recognized degrees of harm, established proportional punishment, and created mechanisms for social restoration rather than just retribution. The Sumerian world of independent city-states couldn't last. Around 2300 BC, everything changed when a Semitic military leader from the north unified Mesopotamia under a single authority for the first time in history. Sargon of Akkad remains one of history's most enigmatic figures. Contemporary documentary evidence about his life is remarkably scarce. His capital city of Akkad has never been definitively located, and much of what later traditions claimed about him may be legend rather than history. But the impact of his conquests is undeniable. Sargon conquered all of southern Mesopotamia, extended his control into Syria, Anatolia, and modern scholars point to evidence of Western Iran, and established the world's first true empire, a collection of diverse peoples and cities under centralized authority emanating from his capital. The Akkadian Empire didn't destroy Sumerian civilization. It transformed it. Sargon and his successors recognized the sophisticated administrative systems, religious traditions, and cultural achievements of the Sumerians and integrated them into imperial governance. Akkadian, a Semitic language distantly related to modern Arabic and Hebrew, gradually replaced Sumerian as the spoken language of administration and daily life. But Sumerian remained the language of religion, scholarship, and high culture, much as Latin would function in medieval Europe long after it ceased to be anyone's native tongue. This cultural synthesis created what scholars call Sumero-Akkadian civilization. Akkadian scribes used Sumerian cuneiform to write their own language, adopting and adapting the writing system to fit Semitic phonology. Akkadian rulers sponsored Sumerian religious festivals, maintained Sumerian temples, and claimed legitimacy through their patronage of traditional Sumerian deities. Sumerian literature continued to be copied and studied, even as new works were composed in Akkadian. The boundary between conqueror and conquered became increasingly blurred as generations passed. The Akkadian Empire reached its zenith under Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, who claimed divine status and had himself depicted wearing the horned crown that traditionally marked a god. But after Naram-Sin, the empire began to fragment. His successors faced both internal revolts and external pressures. Sometime around 2200 BC, the Akkadian Empire collapsed. The causes of collapse remain disputed. Ancient sources blame the Gutians, mountain peoples from the east who invaded and established their own short-lived dynasty. Severe climate disruption, the so-called 4.2 kilo-year event, a major drought that appears in geological records across the Near East. Fossil coral data from Oman published in 2019 suggests that prolonged winter dust storms and harsh cold seasons disrupted agriculture, leading to crop failures and famine that the imperial administration couldn't overcome. Environmental stress, administrative breakdown, and military defeat likely combined in ways that mutually reinforced collapse. Whatever the precise causes, the Akkadian collapse threw Mesopotamia into what later historians called a dark age. The Gutians held nominal control but never established effective centralized authority. Archaeological evidence from this period is sparse, suggesting economic and cultural disruption on a massive scale. From this chaos emerged the third dynasty of Ur, Sumer's final period of independence, and perhaps its greatest flowering. Around 2100 BC, Ur-Nammu, governor of the city of Ur, defeated both the Gutians and rival Sumerian leaders to establish a new dynasty that would rule for approximately 100 years. This period, called the Neo-Sumerian or Ur III period, saw a remarkable revival of Sumerian culture, language, and political power. Documents were once again written in Sumerian. Monumental building projects resumed, and literary production flourished. Ur-Nammu's achievements were staggering. He constructed the great Ziggurat of Ur, whose ruins still dominate the landscape. He promulgated that earliest law code. He reorganized the empire's administration, creating a bureaucratic system whose sophistication wouldn't be matched until much later empires. Land was organized into state-controlled estates. Agricultural production was meticulously recorded on clay tablets. Taxation was standardized. A network of roads connected cities, enabling both trade and military communication. His son and successor Shulgi reigned for 47 years and transformed the Ur-III state into perhaps the most efficiently administered empire in the ancient world. Shulgi standardized weights and measures across the empire, established schools to train scribes in both Sumerian and Akkadian, reformed the calendar, and created an extensive courier system. Tens of thousands of administrative tablets from his reign have been recovered, documenting everything from sheep shearing to grain distribution to diplomatic correspondence. The bureaucracy tracked worker productivity, ration allotments, and resource flows with obsessive precision. But beneath this remarkable administrative achievement, fundamental problems were growing. The intensive irrigation agriculture that supported the empire's population was causing soil salinization. As water evaporated from irrigated fields, it left behind mineral salts that gradually poisoned the soil. Archaeological evidence shows declining crop yields and shifting cultivation patterns as farmers abandoned salinized land. The empire's rigid economic structure depended on consistent agricultural surplus. As that surplus diminished, the system couldn't adapt. External pressures mounted. Amorite nomads from the west began infiltrating Mesopotamia, sometimes peacefully integrating into cities, sometimes raiding settlements and disrupting trade routes. King Shusin built a massive wall. Later sources called it the repeller of the Amorites, attempting to keep the nomads out. But walls can't solve economic and environmental crises. The final king of Ur, Ibbi-Sin, inherited an empire already in terminal decline. Provinces declared independence. One governor named Ishbi-Era seized control of the crucial cities of Isin and Nippur, declared himself king, and founded a rival dynasty. Ibbi-Sin's authority crumbled until he controlled little beyond Ur itself. The end came in 2004 BC when the Elamites from western Iran sacked Ur. The city was burned. Its great ziggurat was desecrated. Ibbi-Sin was captured and carried off to Elam in chains. Sumerian lament texts written after this catastrophe preserve the emotional devastation. Corpses were piled at the lofty city gates. The plain that was covered in grass has become cracked like a kiln. Oh, Father Nana, your city has been made into ruins. The destruction of Ur wasn't just political or economic collapse, it was theological crisis. Nana, the moon god who had protected Ur for millennia, had failed his people. How could the divine order be trusted if even patron deities couldn't prevent catastrophe? This spiritual trauma echoed through Mesopotamian religious thought for centuries. With Ur's fall, Sumerian independence ended forever. The language continued to be used in religious and scholarly contexts for another 1,000 years. But, as a living tongue, Sumerian gradually went extinct. The population was absorbed into the Akkadian-speaking majority. By the time of Hammurabi's Babylonian Empire, a few centuries later, Sumerian had become an antiquarian interest for scholarly scribes preserving ancient traditions. Yet, to say the Sumerians disappeared would profoundly misunderstand their legacy. They didn't vanish. They transformed. Every significant Mesopotamian civilization that followed, from Babylon to Assyria to the Persian Empire, built directly on Sumerian foundations. The cuneiform script that Sumerian scribes invented continued to be used for 3,000 years. Babylonian astronomers used it to record observations that modern scholars recognize as the foundation of mathematical astronomy. Assyrian kings used it to chronicle their conquests. Hittite scribes in Anatolia adapted it for their Indo-European language. Even in the 1st century AD, cuneiform tablets were still being inscribed. Sumerian literature lived on through Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian copies. The Epic of Gilgamesh spread across the Near East in multiple language versions. Sumerian hymns and prayers were recited in Babylonian temples. Legal concepts pioneered in Ur-Nammu's code influenced Hammurabi and every later Mesopotamian law collection. The agricultural techniques, architectural forms, mathematical systems, astronomical knowledge, religious concepts, and administrative practices that the Sumerians developed became the common inheritance of Near Eastern civilization. When Hebrew scribes wrote the creation accounts in Genesis, they drew on Mesopotamian cosmological traditions with clear Sumerian roots. When Greek astronomers calculated planetary movements, they used Babylonian star catalogs that preserved Sumerian observational data. When Islamic scholars translated ancient mathematical texts, they encountered Sumerian base 60 notation preserved through millennia of transmission. The very concept of civilization as we understand it, urban living, written records, codified law, specialized labor, monumental architecture, complex religion, crystallized first in Sumer, not because the Sumerians were uniquely gifted or divinely chosen, but because specific environmental, social, and historical conditions in southern Mesopotamia, around 4000 BC, created opportunities that the people living there were clever enough to exploit. We're still deciphering Sumerian secrets. Remember those 500,000 clay tablets? Most remain untranslated, unread, their contents unknown to modern scholarship. They sit in museums and research collections, waiting. What medical knowledge do they preserve? What mathematical insights? What historical events that could reshape our understanding of ancient politics? What literature that could rival Gilgamesh in power and beauty? Every few years, scholars working in the unglamorous field of Assyriology announce a new discovery, a previously unknown Sumerian myth, a royal inscription that changes our chronology, an economic text that reveals unsuspected trade connections, a mathematical technique that predates Greek innovations by millennia. The Sumerians left us an enormous archive. We've barely begun to read it, and here's what makes this personally meaningful rather than just academically interesting. The innovations the Sumerians pioneered didn't stay in ancient Mesopotamia. They spread. Writing enabled the preservation and transmission of knowledge across generations. Mathematical systems enabled engineering and commerce. Legal codes provided frameworks for justice beyond personal vengeance. Urban living created density that sparked innovation. These tools and concepts migrated across cultures, transforming with each transmission, but retaining their core functions. When you check the time and see minutes and seconds, you're using Sumerian mathematics. When you read any alphabetic script, you're using a technology whose ancestor was Sumerian cuneiform. When modern legal systems distinguish between different categories of crime requiring different punishments, they echo principles first articulated in Ur-Nammu's code. The Sumerians aren't distant ancestors we study out of antiquarian curiosity. They're the foundation. Civilization didn't begin in one place or emerge from one people. Complex societies developed independently in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes, but the Sumerians were first. Their experiments in writing, law, mathematics, and urban organization provided templates that other societies would adopt, adapt, and improve. Their successes and failures taught lessons that echo across history. Their achievements set standards that subsequent civilizations measured themselves against. So when you stand in the desert of southern Iraq, where the dry wind scatters dust across ancient ruins, where the Ziggurats that once dominated the landscape now crumble back into earth, you're standing at the birthplace of the modern world. The voices that spoke Sumerian have been silent for thousands of years, but what they built, the ideas they created, the systems they pioneered, the possibilities they proved viable, those endure. The Sumerians transformed humanity from scattered agricultural villages into urban civilizations capable of monumental achievements. They proved that human beings could organize themselves into complex societies, preserve knowledge across generations, codify law, map the heavens, and create art that transcends its moment. Everything that came after, built on what they established. If you found this journey into Sumerian civilization fascinating, make sure to like this video and subscribe to History Scrolls TV for more deep dives into ancient civilizations and the remarkable people who built our world. The past isn't dead. It's living in everything we do. And the Sumerians are still speaking, if we take the time to listen.